So the building blocks of the datasets, as mentioned, is the activities. How we're doing this is across different datasets and research that we have at S&P Global Sustainable One collected or researched with our teams. So what we're starting with is actually a dataset that's called the business involvement screens. And that was initially built out as an quote unquote exclusionary dataset to help clients who, for example, want to flag companies involved in tobacco or in thermal coal, those kinds of activities. So that is the basis of the dataset in order to identify what is the company actually involved in, either from a revenue perspective, meaning they're actually making money out of this, or from an ownership perspective, meaning they directly are not doing these activities, but are invested in companies or the activities directly. So that is the first bit that we're going to look at. The second bit is enhanced through our environmental dataset. The environmental dataset takes the fossil fuel and energy bit of our business involvement screens and takes it one level deeper, which means that for fossil fuel and energy, we also go into a lot more granularity as compared to, for example, consumer products, defense and weapons, and healthcare, which are much broader to understand. For example, for consumer products, if you're involved in tobacco, it's pretty straightforward. You're involved in tobacco, either manufacturing directly or supporting products, or you're selling them. If you own supermarkets, that means that there is an activity you are doing that is still supporting that activity. For fossil fuel and energy, it goes into a lot more details, especially if you're starting to look at energy companies, oil and gas companies. You drill it down to actually identify, well, what are the activities of that companies? Is it petroleum refineries? Or is there actually a small percentage that the company is starting to look into related to solar power generation or wind power generation? So that's where we start seeing that positive impact as well. If companies aren't involved in, again, tobacco, gambling, etc., that's already a good sign. We want to look at what they're doing negatively. But also it could be that beyond that, there are additional activities that are contributing positively, which we have aligned across 464 business activities that we're looking at, which are mapped to the NICS sectors. That's the North American Industry Classification System. For those in the EU, it is essentially the North American version of the NACE or NAS sectors, which again is very granular. So that's what we're using as our basis. On top of that, the last building block is then going to be what we call the MSA, the Media and Stakeholder Analysis. That is actually the controversy building block of our ESG scores, meaning on a day-to-day, weekly basis, we have analysts that are actually looking through the media, the news, to see if companies have been flagged for any controversial activities, anything that could be considered controversial in the workplace or externally in relation to the community, for example. All of this is then flagged to add on that additional layer of negative impact. So those are all the building blocks just to initially produce that positive or negative alignment. On top of that, the other thing we need to do is see, well, where are those companies operating? And that's something that we're going to speak to a little bit later once we start talking about countries and sovereigns. But we also look at the operational revenue of the company, meaning, are you maybe producing activities that are good for women, so in alignment with gender equality, SDG 5? But where are you also doing this? Is it in Egypt, for example? I'm from Egypt, so I always use it as an example because it doesn't offend anyone. Somewhere where, according to the UN SDG index, which again it's not an S&P methodology, we took this directly from the UN report, the Sustainable Development Report, where they have ranked companies on a scale from 0 to 100 to give them an SDG score, essentially. And we can see that they're lacking, for example, on SDG 5. But if a company is operating in Egypt and producing activities that are considered to be helpful for gender equality, then we give them an additional bonus, an additionality, right? So all of this builds the different dimensions, let's say, or the different layers that you've got in order to, as an output, be able to say, are you in fact, as a net score, contributing positively, moderately positively, very negatively to the SDGs? And that can also be converted into a score, right? So it's not only a label, but also a score. That way it's easy then when clients are using this data to be able to decide if they'd rather use a label, if they'd rather use the score and themselves create their own ladder, let's say, or hierarchy of scoring or labeling, to then set their own thresholds. Similarly to how clients will look at scores, for example, or ratings, they may themselves set thresholds. They may say that, well, a regulation says, for example, you cannot commit to companies that are producing more than 5% thermal coal. But not everyone has a regulation. Sometimes it's just internal thresholds or wanting to set their own targets and therefore wanting to abide by frameworks or standards that would do that. So we're empowering clients to be able to set those themselves or helping them with the regulatory requirements that they've got in alignment to impact, for example, or positive impact.